All right, welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar. I am Nick St. Pierre, Chief Technology Officer at Agilicus, and today's webinar is a platform showcase. We are going to see how we can meet the cybersecurity recommendations of the EPA in public water systems, both for drinking water and wastewater systems. What we'll be demonstrating are practical steps that are applicable to the Agilicus NEX platform in implementing some of these recommendations. So we'll start and explain a little bit about what the Agilicus platform is. First of all, it enables zero trust as a principle for accessing resources for a water utility, while providing maximum security. And this is really important in operational technology settings where we want to continue to ensure uninterrupted services. We want to start providing simple and secure single sign-on solutions. We always want to meet and exceed where we can the cybersecurity requirements, both from a regulatory perspective, but also from a best practices approach. Ultimately, it's about bridging the gap from cybersecurity requirements, seamless user experience, and business continuity for our services. So today we'll be looking at the importance of the cybersecurity requirements for public water systems. I'll talk a little bit about the primary needs paradox that occurs when we start talking about providing access to legacy systems and how that was originally implemented. I'll look at the 5 points of cybersecurity best practices that we need to implement in a platform and practically how that is implemented in the Agilicus NEX platform. I will show you screenshots of our platform and align them with those requirements, and we can finish up with a couple Q&A sessions if we have some time. So let's look a little bit about the essentials for public water systems. We do need cybersecurity in those, don't we, right? The EPA certainly thinks so. The concept of zero trust, the concept of cybersecurity best practices has started to come down this year. The EPA has issued recommendations and a memorandum to stress the need for states to assess cybersecurity risks in drinking water system, and it does so via what is called sanitary surveys. Those can be undertaken, those security surveys, by the water authority themselves, a municipal government, or a third party via pre-existing plans for cybersecurity audits or new ones as well. These are meant to be periodic. These are meant to ramp up in the application of best practices, and they're really the go-to for implementing the cybersecurity practices as we start to open up some of these systems in operational technology, whether from an industrial control system perspective that have largely been isolated or air-gapped from public networks or IT networks and municipal networks, but also now that we're migrating a little bit more to DCS or distributed control systems, where we start making and leveraging cloud access for big data and for analytics, for example, and there's a two-way street now between sensors and data lakes. This becomes more and more important. So why would we do this? Well, public utilities, operational technology, industrial control systems as a whole have been a rich target environment for threat actors. There are over 150,000 public water systems in the US. 90% of them support drinking water across the territory. The number one fear in the industry are cyber threats. And the reason for that is operational technology network and public water systems have really been meant to continue to be operational at any given time. There is no margin for downtime, planned or unplanned. Therefore, when cyber threat actors either do crypto lockers, ransomware, for example, there's a huge incentive for public water systems and municipal government to pay out. And this is known by these malicious actors, whether state or privately funded. There's 300 million citizens behind the American public water system. It becomes extremely critical. And what we see oftentimes is that data breaches have occurred through stolen credentials. Now, those could be through social engineering, theft of credential, but most often than not, the consequences are that of a large blast radius when these breaches occur that leads threat actors or bad actors to control parts of the industrial control systems, such as public water systems, and have huge implications. So those are the key stats. So the paradox of the primary need. Historically, OT systems tend to live in what I call legacy environments. The reason for that is the life cycles of these systems is quite long compared to IT. We can have HMIs or SCADA systems that are 10 or 15 years old that are known to operate well on a fixed platform without patch-up policies, for example, and therefore there's an enhanced need to secure these assets. What we've done historically is given access via VPN for users to manage these systems remotely on a per need basis. The reliance here has been on internet connected systems and to provide VPN. And why VPN is the only method of access has been one of technology, not one of requirement. We ultimately want to give access to an industrial control system, whether that's an HMI, a PLC, a management system, an IoT management system. We don't necessarily want to give network access, but that's the method by which we are delivering the need to control these individual systems. This reliance on VPN has increased the opportunity for bad actors. Why? Because once you grant access to the network, you're really giving layer 3 access. People are most oftentimes able to navigate east-west and traverse these systems, especially in the industrial control systems, and then have access across the network to other compromised devices. The reality is that users still need remote access, and I asterisk the user here because more and more these are machine to machine. The users can also be a machine. So we may need vendor access, we may need third-party access, contractor access, seasonal worker access. And more we see machine-to-machine analytics, cloud, big data lakes, for example, to sensor environment. So what is the primary need that we need to ask ourselves? Is it network access into my industrial control system? Or is it really that I want a third-party contractor to access securely a very specific part of my environment, regardless of the network or security paradigm that is behind it? And that's what we're going to address. So when we start applying the best practices in OT or public water systems as well, from a cybersecurity perspective, there's really 5 things we need to do well. First one is to move to identity verification, and that's a big change. We need to move from username and passwords to who you are, and that's different. Having username and password credentials is one thing if we use, for example, shared accounts for accessing a resource. But what if I really need to know that it's Joe at contractor 1, for example, that is accessing this HMI, regardless of whether the HMI understands the concept of users or even session? What if I need to let specific vendors or specific personnel within those vendor environment? What if I have seasonal employees that need access to specific resource in my public water systems at very specific time of the day, for example? That's very important. And that is moving beyond username and password from an authentication realm. We're talking about identity, who you are from an identity perspective, but what you know from a 2-factor or multi-factor play as well. The second one that's very important to implement is least privilege access. Historically, we've given VPN access. Keys of the kingdom, you can access the network, you can access the resource, you have unfettered access to this resource to do maybe a lot more than the role or the task calls for. Users don't need 100% access to your network. They don't even need access to the network. What they need is access to the resource with the least amount of privilege or permissions needed to accomplish their task. And that's very important once we move into a zero trust environment. I only trust you as far as the task that is required to be accomplished. The third one is microsegmentation. That's very well understood in a Purdue model, for example, where we have our layers in OT, and we understand that certain control zones don't need access to other ones. This is very important when we start implementing cybersecurity practices. We want to isolate within the network the resources that are located there. So let's think about the perimeter. Let's get rid of that perimeter, and let's isolate every single resources on the network. This is not a far-fetched idea. We're simply shrinking what used to be the network perimeter now to the device itself or to the resource itself. The fourth one Continuous monitoring and logging is important when we start understanding the concepts of GRC, or governance, risk management, and compliance. And these are coming down the pike. And for public water systems, it's going to be very important to understand at any given time that we need to have records and evidence of who did what and when. And when I say who, I go back to the first item, identity. It's not enough to know that a single sign-on or a shared credential was used for an entire organization or an entire contractor, for example, at a certain time. I need to know that it was Jim or Joe that used that credential, that shared credential, for example, to come into my environment. I need to have a non-repudiated source of data that attests to that in very clear term, that I can create an audit trail to understand who came in and what and did and how. And lastly, I want to simplify my vendor access management. I don't want to get a call from one of my vendors as a public water system saying, Joe left employment last month, can you please turn off his credentials? That is a big no-no. It's always difficult to track who's coming in and out, especially if you're at the mercy of getting notified that the user's credential either left the company or the employment was terminated. You need to be in sync with that workflow, both from an onboarding perspective to accelerate vendor access, but also from an offboarding perspective. You don't want to be left with dangling accounts. And that's where the concept of identity comes on. So, questions you need to ask yourself when you implement these 5 things from a public water system point of view. And these are very important to go down to your checklist, right? Do you currently provide remote access today? And if so, how? And do the current accounts, for example, that I have active reflect the actual usage? Do I have 21 VPN accounts when I only have 3 contractors accessing my site? Do I immediately disable the account either when the user is no longer affected by the work that they need to do on my site, or when access is no longer required, or when the task is complete? If I let someone in for a maintenance window, it's not really a best practice to leave that account open 24 hours a day. Do I require multi-factor authentication? The answer should be yes. How is it enforced on third parties? Do you know that your third party or your contractors have multi-factor authentication? And not all multi-factor authentications are equal. I certainly wouldn't recommend SMS, for example. But if you don't know that they're enforcing it, how they're enforcing it, do they use an SMS reflector where everyone gets that PIN code? Again, a big no-no. So you should be able to implement multi-factor yourself beyond the identity system that your vendors use. Do you collect security logs? Where do you send them? Do you have incident detection and response? For example, you're able to conduct investigation. If a customer, if a contractor, if a third party or an employee, for example, leaves their laptop unattended in a restaurant, comes back half an hour later, are you able to quickly pull an audit to verify whether an attempt was made into accessing the network? Do I, as a public water system or utility, do I separate my users and the privileged accounts? Do I have the concept that the user is separate from the privileges that they may have on a specific resource? That's very important. I may need to give a contractor, Joe, a certain level of access for a certain task today. Next week, I may need him to access a different resource with different levels of privilege. Again, very important that this be flexible enough that I can go back and remove access and always give the least level of permission required. What is my policy on encryption and confidentiality for data in transit? And I say in transit because we shouldn't really have data at rest in between the public water system, an EOT network, and a contractor or third party or vendor access. I want to make sure that all data is in transit. It's not cached anywhere. It's not archived anywhere. But what's the effective encryption scheme? Things like VNC, for example, is very popular to share screen, uses DES encryption, very obsoleted. I may not want to do that with port forwarding on my firewall, but VNC as a utility is very useful. I can share screens. So are there ways where I can effectively enhance the confidentiality by having a strong cipher suite over these applications? And the last 2 are very important. Do I have shared accounts? Do I have one account per contractor? If so, probably a practice to move away from, but maybe cumbersome to implement. What if I can layer on top of that identity verification? I know that it is Joe at contractor A using a shared account tech to come into a VNC session, for example. This can really realign your policies with the regulation. Lastly, one that's quite often already implemented. How do I segment my OT and my IT? Do I have a DMZ in my public water system? Do I deny all connections to my OT network? Do I have a true air gap? Do I need to make exception in my firewalls, both at the IT, but also in between the IT and OT and my DMZ? And what are those exceptions, and how do I track them? Wouldn't it be better if I had no inbound exceptions, where everything was actually sealed off from a security posture management? Any scan on my firewall returns 0 hit because there's nothing listening there. That would be obviously more secure. So let's look at how that is implemented. How do we put that in practice? That would be done through zero trust. And when we talk about zero trust, there's obviously the NIST standard, but what it boils down to in the Agilicus platform is we always ask the 3 questions: who needs access? What authorization, what permission, who are these users, and what is the resource they need access to? And the third one is how. How am I going to route them to their destination, to that resource securely, and only allow them to use the level of privilege that they're entitled for? Very important. So whenever I talk about these three units, in and of themselves, in isolation, they do not confer access to any resource. But when all matched together, then I have a very unique relationship of an identity, a permission, and a resource that they can access. So whenever we talk about zero trust, let's remember the identity of who, the authorization of what, and the access of how I give them access. So let's talk a little bit about identity. Even from, for example, if in my water treatment plant, I need to give access to a contractor, these contractors are still beings and people, and they own something and they identify themselves. I may need them to access with a shared account in a VNC, for example, but each person should be readily identifiable. What are their credentials? And it should not matter what their credentials are, and I should not have to create new ones for them to access a resource. Whether they're using Office 365, Azure, Google, any OpenID Connect, for example, LinkedIn, Facebook, if we need to get to that. But I should be able to verify their identity through an existing shared identity providers. I should be able to actually enforce multi-factor authentication that is not shared, that is unique to them, regardless of where they are, regardless of their employer. Could be a huge engineering firm that has their own Azure AD, for example, and therefore they log in through a Microsoft dialog. It could be a small contractor, self-employed, for example, that uses their Gmail account, and I should still be able to apply the same federation of identity across my zero trust model from identity. If I know who they are, and I'm confident that they've used their factor authentication, then I can create very fine-grained how and what. For example, I can create authorization rules to a very specific resource, not to a network, but to a resource for each identity, even with the shared credentials. And I can do so on a time-based basis, for example, 9 to 5 until July 31st for the next 6 hours. I can have a very granular audit of what was done by that identity. All of this can be done and should be done without the use of network access. And that's where VPN comes in. I shouldn't have to use a virtual private network that marries 2 networks together, that allows the forwarding of data from that individual's or organization's network to mine. I should only allow the resource to connect to the user. And I should also do this with a very clean security posture. I should not have inbound ports on my firewall. I should not have to listen for VPN connection. I should not have critical systems exposed through the DMZ. So how do we do this? We mix up identity and challenges, requirements all together, the who, what, and the how. And we end up with some requirements here that are based along the best practices. So I want to authenticate unlike users. I just mentioned that. I want to do it per resource. I want to provide transparent access. I should not have to impose a client or a specific network stack on my users. Everybody knows how to use a browser, for example. Everybody's familiar with the industrial application they may be using in a public water system, whether SCADA-based or other, and they should be able to continue to use this in the same fashion. That would simplify the user experience, drive to adoption, increases security completely transparently and by design. So it's not an additional layer of toil or behavior that I'm imposing on the user to be more secure. And that way I get more efficiency and more value out of my employees, but also out of my processes. So I want to be able to do this on site. I want to be able to do this in my truck as I'm traveling from site to site, for example. It may be driven by cybersecurity insurance compliance. So we're seeing more public water systems now getting a mandate or through the municipal insurance plan to have these types of best practices implemented. Ultimately, I can manage my vendors the same way I manage my users that are local to my plan. And I can continue to provide protection to my critical infrastructure using those best practices. So how does Agilicus implement that? Well, in the platform NEX, what we do is very easy. Like in the example that we see in the screen now, I am implementing existing credentials. I blurred out the names of the innocents here, but you can see that Mark, Mike, and myself are added to the platform simply by understanding what their email addresses are. The email address ties me to an identity via the identity provider. In the case of Agilicus, for example, we use Google's G Suite. So I want to be able to leave that password completely out of my systems. I don't want to have to deal with credential and access management. I just want to deal with identities, and I want to make them quickly onboarded and offboarded. Actually interact with this very easily. In the case of Agilicus, I'm using my G Suite powered account through Google for agilicus.com, but it could be a local NT machine, could be an Office 365 and Azure AD. I can integrate my vendor onboarding, such as whenever a new employee for that vendor domain signs up into our portal, they're automatically created, and they can optionally automatically inherit the resources and permission that are necessary for their role and task within my public water system. I also want to implement multi-factor. I may not know if Bob, for example, at Contractor Hay is using MFA, but I can actually enforce it and then implement MFA not only for that identity, but at the granular level for very specific legacy resources that have no concept for sessions, users, or even multi-factor. And now I can protect legacy systems, HMIs, for example, with MFA. All of this now becomes very useful if I need to onboard a user, offboard a user, because they either expired their access to their resource or their identity management system no longer authenticates them. So even if they have a shared credential, once they leave their employment, for example, they can get denied access based on the time that they've expired on their access to their resource, or not being able to authenticate themselves anymore with the organization. So this is one way of implementing it. The second one is the fine-grained resource and authorization. Like I mentioned, the who, the what, and the how. I want to pair the resource that I may have here, could be an HMI, could be VD SCADA, could be an internal website like a wiki, and I want to pair it with the identity. So I'm now doing two things. I want to give fine-grained controls of that access. And what I mean by fine-grained control, if you imagine an HMI, for example, that may have one whole interface that is clickable throughout, I may choose to isolate portions of that application, create roles where none existed prior due to the legacy nature of the applications. This is done through our web application firewalls. Like I mentioned, I can also create users and groups so that contractors can inherit very specific roles and resources as soon as I define the role that they need and the resources that they require to accomplish their tasks. I can do self-provisioning of these resources. I may understand that Joe has a specific task to accomplish, but next week he may need access to a very specific system that he does not have access to on a regular basis. I will want to have him to self-provision and self-request that role and those permissions, and an administrator can come in and grant those. So having those fine-grained resources and authorization to them is very important, and we implement that into the Agilicus NEX platform. Ultimately, what I'm talking about, and I've mentioned that a couple of times now, is we want to shift away from the network. And I'm trying to draw here in a comparison where instead of pairing an identity to a resource, the VPN has traditionally, through the need paradox, has traditionally opened the gate of the organizations, in this case, our public water system, to third parties by mixing their networks together. Once we do this, we're providing way too much trust and way too wide an access to anyone connected on the network. We also run into use cases where, for example, the networks are not compatible or overlap their IP space, where I need to access either a sensor, a PLC, an industrial control device that is bearing an IP address that is pre-existing on my network. I should not have any concerns for the knowledge of the network addressing or the network topology, or the way that the network is air-gapped to actually have access to it. I can elevate the access from user to network in a legacy system to one that is more representative of identity to a resource, and have external vendors access those resource with the least permission set. So this is what we end up with when we abstract and move away from the VPN. I now have the how. I can have an employee, either on-site or remote, have the same experience when they access the remote resource. They can access the HMI on-site via a local connector that is providing access to an air-gapped HMI, for example. Another vendor could be completely remote and access a dashboard through the site without having to come in through a firewall exception to a VPN concentrator. In this case, we're using the Agilicus NEX connector software to provide outbound-only connectivity to a cloud platform, which then provides a reverse proxy and a network access to the very specific resource in a very fine-grained manner, so that only the resource assigned to that users are accessible and no east-west traversal is permitted. We can see now why any compromised device has a very, very limited blast radius should it have access that is unauthorized. All in all, this is what we want to provide in a public water system when we start having to enable vendor access, all through a zero trust model. We want to have outbound only connections. Why? We don't want to have exceptions on our firewall. They're toil to maintain. They're hard to keep in sync. If we do a security assessment, for example, from a security posture, we can see ports listening. We don't want that. We want to have an outbound only connection that is not listening to anything from within our OT network. We want to have fine-grained authorization, and we mean there least privilege access for a resource, for a user, for a site. We want to have detailed auditing. I talked about governance, risk management, and compliance. You want to have complete visibility of who's doing what, when, for how long, the multi-factor that they use, what they did, and so on. Even with shared accounts, I still want to know who it was. I want to keep my assets off the public internet. I don't want to be able to scan and say, oh, there's a VPN concentrator listening there, there's an IPsec there. I want my OT network to remain off the internet. I want my air-gapped resources and device to remain air-gapped so that they no longer have or never have access to the internet on their own. I want to do resource segmentation as we do today, for example, in the Purdue model. I want to have every single application isolated. I want to move away from a perimeter of a zone and really shrink that to the individual resource themselves. Ultimately, what I want is compliance. I want to understand what the EPA is pushing down, what NIST is pushing down, what the White House is pushing down as requirements and best practices. We started hearing zero trust now explicitly in the messaging, and this is how it's implemented. Ultimately, we end up with privileged secure access management for vendors and employees alike, and we're actually are isolating our devices and keeping our operational technology networks secure across all industrial control systems in our water treatment plants. So if you can, reimagine the air gap with zero trust. We can access our HMIs. We can do so locally and remotely in the same experience. Users no longer have access to the full network. They should never have had them. And we do so without any new clients, any new VPN, and we implement security factors like single sign-on and multi-factor authentication. What public water systems customers of Agilicus gain at the same time? Enhanced security, very much increased operational efficiency across all vendors. Adding vendors, removing vendors becomes very easy. And ultimately, we want a seamless user experience. Should not matter whether you're a vendor, whether you're an employee, whether you're remote or local, your experience should be continuous and without new training or new software. If you want to engage with us, you can reach me, Nick at agilicus.com. You can try our Agilicus ANIAX platform for free if you contact us at info@agilicus.com or visit our website and try now. And within minutes, you should be able to actually see the platform at work in your environment. Again, I'm Nicholas St. Pierre, Chief Technology Officer here at Agilicus, and thank you.